All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We're here in Suffolk at Sarah Brin headquarters. Just a couple of us because we're practicing appropriate social distancing. So this has been fun for everybody, I guess. All right, so today we're going to be talking about configuration management for small businesses. We'll go through this a bit, and really this is in relation to the cybersecurity maturity model certification. So things are changing and keeping us busy. We've been focused on not only DFARS, but payment card industry as well as FedRAMP, and the CMMC has come up and we are tracking this pretty specifically. It's been interesting to see for sure. So here with me today is Alexi Johnson. Alexi is one of our senior analysts and is one of our primary folks focusing on CMMC and really understanding the requirement as it applies to small business. So he'll be here with me today. We'll be going through some of these questions, and let's go through these caveats. All right, ideally, we're not going to tell you how to implement CMMC in your business. We don't know your network, we're not familiar with it, and we don't have the capability to give you specific instruction. What I would like to see is everybody should have access to the chat window as well as the Q&A buttons. As we go through this, if you have ideas, concerns, or specific questions, throw them up there in the chat window and we will address them. These are concepts. These aren't going to be specifications or implementations. These are just ways to think about implementing these controls in your business. The CMMC auditing standards are not out. The CMMC guidance is available on the DoD website. Please read those. In particular, the CMMC appendices are a wealth of knowledge and do a really good job of explaining what's required and give some decent examples on how you might implement it in your environment. But there may be changes, there may be differences of opinion, there may be questions and concerns that we can't answer today because of the lack of standards. All right, so why start with CM? And I'm going to kick this over to Alexi, but everything stems from configuration management. And until you've got a good handle on your systems, there's not much you can do. Alexi, you want to talk about this for a sec?
Well, absolutely. And good day to everyone. Configuration management, as Colin mentioned, it is the beginning point for everything that you want to do as it relates to getting your network secured, because configuration management also includes asset management under its umbrella. And quite frankly, you can't secure what you don't know about. So every computer that's operating in your environment, every piece of software that's operating in your environment is all susceptible to being compromised. So the beginning of it all, as you mentioned, starts with first asset management, and then following that up with you begin to secure those things that you know about. And you also, you look for vulnerabilities. So listed here, you see that the top 6 Center for Internet Security critical security controls, they all include some level of configuration management. And that's what's depicted on the screen, the top 6 out of the entire 20. So configuration management is the beginning.
And can you talk a little bit about what these top 6 are? I mean, is there a point to them? Is there like an implementation level guide?
Actually, there is. So the critical security controls, they've created in what's called implementation groups based on the type of business that you are. So because this is geared towards small businesses, this particular framework, Implementation Group 3, really has some good information regarding all 20 of the critical security controls, but specifically Implementation Group 3 has a lot of basic things that could be done to really start securing your infrastructure. And that begins, as you see, number 1 and number 2 from the previous slide. They have to do with inventory and controlling of both your hardware and your software.
So apparently we're having some slide issues. So give me just a second.
Let me see here. Yeah, so as I mentioned, everything stems from inventory of both your hardware and your software. And like I said, the implementation groups kind of talk you through exactly what you need to do as it relates to those particular things. So if you're interested and you take a look at those, you want to focus on implementation group 1 and possibly a few small things in group 2, for small businesses.
All right. So, as y'all probably just saw, where do we start with CMMC or configuration management?
First step, creating an inventory. And oftentimes, creating an inventory, it seems like a very daunting task, but realistically, creating an inventory is as simple as, having a spreadsheet. And we're going to get more into that as we go on, but that's really the beginning. As you create that inventory, you roll into deciding what you need and what you need to get rid of, because as you do an inventory, similar to, when you're doing spring cleaning, you're going to find things in your closet that's a part of your inventory, but you may not need it. So from an IT security standpoint, those things that you don't need often can introduce risk, because if you don't need it and it has a vulnerability that goes unpatched, you could have problems with that. And the next step is securing what you have. Whatever you decide to keep, you want to secure it and make sure that it's not susceptible to compromise. This next step is, I know that creating an inventory is the beginning, but I would argue that the change management process is probably the most important piece, because that's the only way that you're going to ensure that change management configuration management is implemented appropriately across your enterprise, is by having an effective change management process. And then, of course, you rinse and repeat and do it over and over again. And we're going to talk about these in a little bit of detail as we go throughout.
All right, so we're creating an inventory. So I have to assign systems to staff members?
Well, it's not so much as that you assign them to the staff members. It's really, this is how you develop what your inventory is. We're sitting here today and we both have a company issued laptop. And one easy way to wrap our minds around the inventory is to determine, okay, who do I have working for me? Who actually has an asset that's been assigned to them? And that becomes the beginning of your hardware inventory, based off the simple fact that, all right, everybody who works for me, they have a device that's assigned to them. So that's the beginning of what will become your inventory.
So I've already issued, or everybody already has laptops.
Mm-hmm.
How do I get this information?
You could simply contact your members and give them the type of information that's required. Serial number, model number, things like that. If you've done good accounting, your accounting personnel may have this type of information already available, because these are company assets. So they'll be a part of what's listed as your holdings from an asset standpoint. But if you don't, the simplest way is to fire out an email to everybody and say, hey, we're trying to collect some information. Can you please provide us your model number and your serial number? And you may want to send them a picture of, hey, this is what that type of information looks like. And where necessary, this type of information can be parsed without having any level of privileged access or credentials. You can actually take them through those steps as well. And what I mean by that is simple things like running an MS info, so that, and specifically speaking from a Windows standpoint, if you run simple things like MS info or just look at system information, in many cases, it'll have the serial number and it'll have the model number of the device that you actually are using.
Awesome. All right, so obviously we have laptops and maybe somebody has some desktops and things, but what about that printer, router? What do I do with those? How do I inventory those?
So this is where the fun starts. Nobody ever thinks about these things, but you actually want to add these to your inventory as well. So these things wouldn't be assigned specifically to any one person, but it would be a good idea to just go ahead and assign somebody within your office to bear the responsibility of inventorying everything that can be connected to the internet within your environment. So it doesn't matter exactly who it is, whether you have an IT staff member or whether you assign this to anybody who works for your company. Somebody should bear the responsibility of collecting the information on the types of devices that you have connected. And this will become more apparent as to why this is important as we get through a couple of the other sections related to what we're discussing today.
And what's Nmap?
Nmap is an enumeration tool that is basically designed.
What's enumeration?
So that's a good question. Many people don't know what enumeration is. Enumeration is similar to what's happening. Many of you have received letters in the mail today regarding the census. And what it's trying to figure out is how many people you have in your house, what are the ages of those people that are in your house, And so an enumeration tool will do that very thing for you. It's designed to parse your network and discover things about it in terms of, for example, if you have an IP subnet, it'll scan that subnet and it'll actually discover what devices are connected throughout your network based on what it can scan.
Now, for a tool like Nmap, is that typically available on a Windows system?
Nmap is an available tool on a Windows system, and generally it's free. Doesn't cost you anything at all. It's something that you can download, connect to a system, fire it off. The only thing you really need to know is the IP scheme that you have in use. Many of you are probably using 192.168.something.something. So you get that information, tell it to go, and it'll spit out you some good information.
Nice. Now, this one is always fun. Identifying what software you have. For a new system, it probably shouldn't be too bad, but if you've been in business for a while, people use lots of different software. How does this work?
It can be a very daunting task. One of the reasons that makes it so daunting, as Colin mentioned, if you've been in business for a while, you probably have done something similar to this. We started out, we bought our computers, maybe we ordered them from somewhere, and they came with a lot of software already installed. We didn't plan on using it, but we left it there. But what also happened is we decided we're going to use this one piece of software, and then we decided later on we're going to move on from that software, but it remained, and then we installed more and more and more and more different types of software. So that's what makes this a challenge, because oftentimes you don't track what you install. You just kind of install it, find out if it works for what you need it for. If it does, you keep using it. If it doesn't, you just find something else. But nobody has effectively figured out exactly what you have installed on your system. So that can be a tough task. It can be done manually. That's the recommended method if there are cost constraints, but a manual process to figure out what software is installed is a very daunting task, but a very necessary one based on the new CMMC standards.
Now, are there good tools that could do this for me?
There are a lot of tools that could do it. We don't want to necessarily, any product that we list, we're not necessarily endorsing those products, but there are categories of tools under the remote management style of tools that can collect this type of information for you. There are some open source tools. Spiceworks is a tool that comes to mind where it can scan your devices and it can pull the software that's installed for you. There are lots and lots and lots of categories of tools who can do it. But again, those would be based on what your requirements are to figure out which one would best work for you.
All right, ports, protocol, services, and functions.
Now, you may be wondering, why is this even on the screen? This is a very, 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 to the infinite degree of tremendous importance, the ports, protocol, services, and functions that you're using. Why? Is because this is how a hacker is going to gain access to your network. If they can compromise any port that's open on your system that you may not be using, you may be using it, but oftentimes what they'll do is they'll compromise a port that's open, available, commonly unused. So you want to find out about every port, the slide says, in use on your network, but really find which ports, protocols, and services are available to be used on your network, because those are keys to the kingdom, so to speak, and we'll talk more about that under the securing what you have. But again, we mentioned the tool Nmap. It is a free and readily available tool that will parse any system on your network and tell you what can be seen from the outside when you look at that from an enumeration standpoint.
All right, so our next step is decide what you need and get rid of what you don't. All right. So a valid business need.
So this is a great question, and I'll just mention a quick story. Was working with a client. The name of the client is not important, but many of you, I'm sure, may have a subscription to something like Spotify, or you may have an iTunes account if you have an iPhone. You really ought to decide whether or not you want those types of software to be installed on your work computers, and you want to do that based on business need, because you may have a valid business need or justification to say, my personnel need iTunes because this is how their morale is going to stay up, being able to listen to music, because maybe they don't have good cell phone reception. And those things are great, but you want to marry those types of requirements to business needs because when you think from an inventory standpoint, I mentioned previously that you can't secure what you don't know about. So it's okay to have those types of things installed, but you have to understand that you have them and you want to marry whatever the business need is as well. So I use the example of music software, but it doesn't really matter what you have. If you use Microsoft Windows 10, it comes with Internet Edge. That may be sufficient. You may have users who want Google Chrome. Well, when you install Google Chrome, you introduce a different level of risk associated with Google Chrome being used versus Internet Edge. So you want to document the reasons why you're doing it and not just allow things to be installed because somebody likes using a specific application, but you want to marry that with a valid business need.
All right, and now we have to categorize applications. Why is this important?
So categorizing applications falls under the concept of creating your system baseline. I believe we're going to talk about that in the next slide, but you categorize your applications as something as simple as core versus non-core. If every user is going to use a specific application, then those will be considered core applications versus you may have somebody in your finance department who's going to use QuickBooks or Quicken or some other financial software. Not every user will be assigned those non-core applications. They'll be specific to an individual. So when you develop your list of applications, the things that you need, you look across the organization. We all need Microsoft Windows 10. We all need Microsoft Office. We all need Adobe Reader. We all need browser XYZ. That's your core list. And then you start looking, okay, what specific functions are being fulfilled by other individuals? Now we need to develop that list as well, because again, you can only secure what you are aware of.
And then redundant software. So some of my engineers like to use various things to their CAD work. Can I let that keep going?
So you can let it keep going. However, it's not recommended. And realistically, this isn't just for security reasons. It's also for financial reasons as well. Oftentimes, companies are moving to subscription-based software methodologies or mechanisms. So if you're running a subscription for 3 different pieces of software that really do the same thing, you probably should start, eliminating 1 or 2 of those softwares. And also, from a management standpoint, when we think small business, you generally think small IT staff. The more pieces of software that are available to be managed, that's a heavier burden that's being placed on a small IT staff. So you really want to eliminate the various types of softwares that you have, especially if they fulfill the exact same purpose. Many of you may be aware that OpenOffice is not necessarily a competitor to Microsoft, but they have an offering that you can use, and it's completely free. However, if you have a subscription to Office 365 and it gives you Microsoft Office, then minimize the risk and just choose one, because it'll be much easier to maintain one of them in the long run instead of having to maintain 2 that do the same thing.
All right, and we're back on ports, protocols, functions, and services.
This is going to be important. I think I mentioned in the previous slide that this is going to be very important. Your computer has lots of ports that are available, possibly 65,000 of them. And all of them at any particular time can be used. I'm sure you all have heard, we're not talking about phishing, but phishing is a major topic across the enterprise because email is used so frequently. If I can get you to click the appropriate link and one of these ports are open and it shouldn't be, now I can successfully compromise your network. And I'm sure everybody on the call understands that users are generally the weakest link in information security. It's not a slight to users, but quite frankly, the business that you perform every day generally isn't information technology. If you are a standard user to a system, you may be more easily, or it may be easier to compromise you versus a seasoned IT professional. So if we can do our jobs and make sure that these ports that are susceptible to compromise are closed if they're not needed, we can help you to ensure that you don't get compromised.
Now, I'd heard something on the news the other day, and it's been a while, but there was a really bad ransomware outbreak. Not Petia, I think was what it was called. Wasn't that a specific port that was open?
I believe it was. I don't remember the specific details of the case, but generally the majority of the ransomwares that happen generally it's because of some port that's been left open that nobody is using.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? While we're talking about it, get rid of what you don't need. There are often times where you may install a piece of software, and that piece of software, it may need to get updates from the internet, and that may work on a specific port for that specific piece of software. One thing that is important to do is when you find that you've removed software, you may want to also take a look using a tool like Nmap to make sure that whatever ports that were associated with that software were actually closed when the software was removed. You know, as an example, we're using Ring Central to provide you a webinar today. Ring Central automatically opens ports when you install it to allow the audio from the application to go out to the internet. If Ring Central is removed, would it automatically close that port, or would that port remain open? So tools like Nmap can really help you out to figure out, here's my baseline of what's there, versus I just removed some software. Did my baseline remain the same, or did some change actually take place? So those are important things to consider.
And don't databases typically open ports?
Databases are 100% open ports. Depending on the application you use, it may use SQL Express, or it may use some instance of Oracle, and those communicate on specific ports. And if you don't do your due diligence to find out what those ports are, you could be leaving yourself highly susceptible to compromise as a result.
All right, so we have to secure what we have. That's always a good idea.
This is the fun part.
All right.
And I say it's the fun part, and the most, it's just not true. It's not fun at all. Creating a system baseline can be a very daunting task if you've been in business for a long time, because there's just not an easy approach to it. But what is a system baseline? It's generally, you have a laptop or you have a desktop. It doesn't necessarily matter about the drivers. It's more so, what is the baseline package that's been installed? And by package, I mean, we have Windows 10. We have Internet Edge. We have Microsoft Office. We have configured our system so that the screensaver turns on after 15 minutes of inactivity. We have configured our systems to automatically log off users after 2 hours of inactivity. All of the software settings, all of the security configurations, all of those make up your system baseline. And that would be the same for everybody across your environment. And that's what we mean by system baseline. You know, we're not talking per se, you know, server baselines, because a lot of small businesses, quite frankly, don't have servers, and they outsource a lot to cloud providers, just because, you know, if you don't have an IT staff to maintain those things. So primarily, while we're talking here, we're primarily addressing, you know, your workstations and the systems that you carry around with you every day.
Now, I have a staff I have an accounting department, I have HR, and then I have my engineers, and I have my day worker, or just regular line workers. Do I have to create 4 separate baselines?
No, you'll create one baseline, and then you'll capture the differences, or what people refer to in this industry as the deltas, based on, you know, who has the extra requirement. So your standard configuration will be the same, and then you just document the appropriate differences, for example, for your accountant or for your engineer. If the changes are drastic enough where they require additional security configurations, then you may want to create a separate baseline. But the general rule of thumb is, whatever the base is, that becomes your baseline, and then you just document any deviations.
And now I have, you know, one superstar employee who says they have to use Apple products. How do I handle that?
Well, that's an easy thing to handle. They may be looking for another job. But no, I joke. Realistically, that happens more than it doesn't happen. And honestly, it often happens at the executive level more than at the standard employee level, because a standard employee has to comply with whatever the office sets. But typically, you see C-suites that feel, I need a MacBook. I need a MacBook Pro, or I need some type of Apple device, or I want to be running on Unix or Linux. If that doesn't support what the company's mission business objectives are, then it shouldn't be allowed. And because the goal of this is securing what you have based on the IT staff that you have as well. And you can put in an Apple device, and sometimes people consider that Apple is not susceptible to compromise, but it's just, it couldn't be further from the truth. So the best thing to do is to standardize everything that can be standardized. And if somebody by chance they have to use a separate type of device, then you may have to just simply isolate it from everything else so that at least you can maintain the security of the rest of the network while minimizing the risk of that one device.
Now, if I do have a staff that does require Linux systems, plus the office uses Windows, would I just create two baselines?
You would create two baselines in that case. You definitely have a baseline for your Linux system because you want to document any security configurations that you have. There are best practices and hardening guides that you can use to help you secure operating systems across the board. So just figuring out what those configurations are and putting them on your baseline will put you in a much better situation.
All right, so group policy, I have to audit that. Do I have group policy?
So it depends on the type of system that you're using. Again, we're primarily talking about Windows systems because that's what the majority of the people are using. The word wouldn't be group policy if you're dealing with a Linux or an Apple system, but conceptually, you would have security configurations that you can configure at a high level, whether it be locally on the system or at a domain level. Your group policy configs would be the summation of all the security settings. I mentioned previously if your computer was going to automatically enact a screensaver after a certain period of time, or if your computer was not going to allow you to log in at a certain time, or if your computer was going to encrypt your hard drive. You know, those will be different types of settings that will be configured in your baseline, and you would want to audit that those configurations are actually being applied appropriately. Because one thing you don't want to do is have a requirement, and your requirement is supposed to be configured, but the system is not actually configured to perform in that way. So that's what your auditing will do for you, is determine, did I configure it the way that it's supposed to be configured based on what the security requirements are.
Now, do all Windows systems support GPOs?
All Windows systems don't support GPOs. So many of you, depending on where you buy your computer from, you may not be aware of this, but cost is often driven by the type of license that you're buying. And if you have a Windows system and you're buying a Windows Home version of operating system, it's generally going to cost less than if you buy a Windows Professional version of operating system. There are a lot of security features from an enterprise level that are not included in the home version. So you don't have group policy settings that you can configure for a home version of Windows. So if you are a company and you're operating using Windows Home, it probably was a great idea because you will maybe able to go to Costco and get 15 systems for a relatively cheap price. However, the cost of that is going to be security. So you will want to upgrade those to some level of professional product as soon as you can. And
if I don't have a domain, right,
mm-hmm.
I just have a bunch of folks and we connect wirelessly and just do our gig, how do I audit this?
So these types of audits, it can happen in a few different ways. The most fun one would probably be manual,
mm-hmm.
and I mean fun in the worst way possible, to go around and literally log into the systems. But there are different tools that you can use. The Center for Internet Security publishes a tool that can be used to actually audit configuration settings. Many of the compliance scanners, many of the vulnerability scanners also offer compliance scanning as a function where you build in what the baseline is supposed to look like, and it can actually audit those settings. Many of these tools can be agent-based, so they would not require you to actually have the device in your hand. It can just report back to a dashboard. So there are different types of tools that are available based on the vendor as well. You know, for example, if you have a Cisco device or maybe you have a WatchGuard device, those are categories of networking devices. They may have a tool that's available for you to actually audit your security configurations to make sure that what you have set is actually being applied.
But I also think, doesn't Microsoft have a tool?
Microsoft does have a tool, and the name of it is escaping me right now.
Security Compliance Manager?
Yes, the Microsoft Security Compliance Manager, or Security Compliance Toolkit.
There we go.
It actually has a policy analyzer where you can have a policy baseline and compare it against the system that you're checking to validate whether or not it has actually been applied appropriately.
And what's the name of the CIS tool?
I believe it's called SysCat. I don't remember exactly what the CAT stands for, but it's Charlie India Sierra Charlie Alpha Tango. In some cases, there is a level of the tool, I believe Syscat Lite, that's free, and then they have a pro version of Well that has a few more bells and whistles for you.
All right. So use a privileged account for daily work. So what's a privileged account?
Well, so let me ask you all a question, and I know I can't see you and you can't see me, but just raise your hand if the account that you use every day can allow you to install new software. I can see you all. Many of you probably raised your hands. Now, if you have good security, you didn't raise your hand, but
we had two.
Oh, you had two that raised their, okay. So,
two. Yep.
So go ahead, with your other hand, just go ahead and smack your hand and say bad, because that's bad. What this, many times when you get that computer and you don't have an IT staff, you're given the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, as it relates to the one laptop that you may be using. Well, the bad thing about that is that's a hacker's paradise, because if they can compromise your day-to-day use account and it just so happens to have privileged access, then you may not know how long that they'll operate on your system before the compromise actually comes. They may be now doing recon and just sitting there and waiting, for a good time, or they may be pivoting and gaining access to other systems on your network as well. So the idea is limit the attack point by having an account that's set up specifically for privileged access that is not used daily. And when you just need to do day-to-day work, you have an account that does not have any level of privileged access. And by privileged, many of you are probably familiar, if it's still turned on, with the UAC, or the user access control prompt that says, hey, you're going to make some changes to the system. Do you want to continue? If you're using a privileged account daily, only thing you'll see is a yes or a no. If you're not using a privileged account daily, it's going to pop up and it's going to prompt you for a username and password. That's hopefully what you see when you're operating. But if it pops up and just says yes or no, that's an indication that you're using a privileged account that has elevated privileges on a daily basis, and that is a bad. You absolutely should not do that. I don't know if I can say this. I wish I knew different languages.
Patching your systems.
Yeah, I wish I knew different languages to be able to say patch your systems. But patching your systems is probably going to get you to about 85% secure on a system just by patching it alone. Many of the zero-day exploits or the different vulnerabilities that are discovered can be resolved or mitigated just by installing security patches. I'm not sure if the group who is on the call are subscribed to receive alerts from US CERT, but this past week has been a pretty big week. They've mentioned vulnerabilities for Adobe, for Microsoft, for VMware, many other products. They have some major vulnerabilities that are out there right now. I believe Google Chrome was possibly on the list as well. Just patching your systems alone can improve the security posture of your environment. Because, coders, they code as best they can. But there are sometimes just things that are found out about a system that nobody could necessarily account for. But once they're found out about, generally that information is published. And once it's published, there's a patch that's often created. So just patching your systems alone will greatly secure your enterprise.
Now, I've got my system set up for automatic updates. Is that good enough?
Automatic updates works in some cases. But some just depends on how you have it set up. Sometimes those automatic updates aren't sufficient. It just depends on what it is. Sometimes it'll only update what's considered to be the most critical issues, and it may leave off some other high issues that are still highly exploitable as well. It just really depends. Using some level of vulnerability scanning would be appropriate to make sure that if you're patching your systems, you want to validate that they're being patched appropriately, because yes, you do want to turn on automatic updates where necessary, but operate off of a zero trust mentality and try to have something in place where you can validate that they're being installed. You always have the fun option of manual validations as well. Microsoft has a Patch Tuesday. If you know that they've patched a specific thing, you can go around to all of your systems and pull up what's been patched and validate that it's actually been patched. But I definitely recommend some level of vulnerability scanning tool to be able to help you find those holes.
Now, Alexa, you work with a lot of customers and you've seen a lot of patch levels. What are some ones that are really need patching quite a bit?
Are you speaking in terms
Something
of
like Adobe and Java?
Adobe is a very unpatched application from what I've seen from many of the clients that I've worked with. Generally, here's what's always, well, I won't say always. Here's what people have a handle on. People have a handle on the operating system. People have a handle on the Microsoft Office suite. But after that, third-party applications generally are not patched as frequently as they should. Because it gets installed and automatic updates is not always turned on by default. And if you don't definitively turn it on, then you may never know that you have a version of Adobe Reader that's susceptible to compromise. So absolutely.
So I've got a remote workforce, and you brought up vulnerability scanning earlier. You know, I've seen it, I've heard of it, but typically it doesn't work so well for a remote workforce because they never come in. So how do I make sure they're patched? How do I make sure that they're scanned?
So this is the fun part when it comes to small businesses, because it often requires some level of financing.
Sure.
And there's not many free tools that are good enough to be able to do this for you. There are categories of tools that will provide you both vulnerability scanning and patch management for all of your systems for your remote workforce. A lot of people don't like the idea of an agent because it really seems like somebody is sitting there watching everything that you're doing. But some of these products, they have an agent, and the agent's job is to go out and look at what the baseline is supposed to be and say, all right, are you patched to the highest security level that you need to be at? And if the answer is yes, then it doesn't do anything. But if it finds that something needs to be updated, then it'll go out and actually pull that patch down for you, actually make sure that it gets installed, and then it'll perform a check again. So those tools are great to be used when you're dealing with a primarily remote workforce. There are ways that you can make it happen if you have a domain and you have a workforce that works remotely. You can make sure that your group policies are configured appropriately to ensure that they get those updates. But sometimes that's a little bit more difficult to deal with, because many of you have probably been guilty of what I'm going to describe. System says, I need updates. Would you like to install them now or defer? Well, many of you click that defer button, and it's often not accepted by the general workforce when the IT staff says, well, we're going to force it or your system's going to shut down. So the best thing to do is to take it out of the hands of your employees and install some tools that will automatically do these updates and keep their system secure so that they'll be less likely to make a mistake that can cause a compromise.
Now, this doesn't have so much to do with compliance, but you know, last year on my home system, I installed the new Windows version, and it broke my system. I got a blue screen of death. Is that common? What happened?
So it's not very common, but it does happen. A lot of times, I'll be honest, just from my experience, and this probably wasn't why it happened to you, but the cheaper the hardware, the more likely you are to have your system get compromised.
But is there something that the company can do in case that does happen?
You create your backups. You create your backups. If you back up your systems, Microsoft has free tools to allow you to back up your systems, and many of the other operating system providers, they have those free tools as well. You create a backup of your baseline, it will be very easy for you to just redeploy that system image, and now you're back up and running again. Because many of us are using tools like Office 365, and we have OneDrive, or we have Dropbox, or many of these other file sharing tools. As long as your user data is secure, you can easily redeploy a system image from your baseline that's been backed up.
All right, so we are at the 140 mark. So I think we're going to speed through the rest of this so we can have some questions at the end.
Okay.
All right. So your critical infrastructure, your servers, your firewalls, they need to be locked up.
Absolutely.
Right.
The big thing here is physical security. You don't want to leave a server in an environment where somebody can just walk up to it and plug something into it. It should be isolated and locked off, and there should be some level of access control to make sure that nobody can get to it.
And we should also probably have some sort of VLAN.
Absolutely.
Virtual LAN where these are off, right?
Absolutely. Those were actually the long in the tooth portions. Everything else is just common sense, and it makes sense that we talk about it.
Okay.
the change management process I mentioned in the beginning, one of the most important things that you can do. In a nutshell, the change management process allows you to put a mechanism in place to review your changes, to get them approved or disapproved, and to document whatever those changes were, and then to audit them to make sure that the intended change is actually what was done.
Now, I do have a question on this. So the one person or office should have approval, disapproval authority. Is that the same person who makes the changes?
The person who has the approval or disapproval authority is definitely not the person that makes the changes. At that point, there is no real separation of duties. And, you know, the risk of malevolent activity or collusion is much more likely when the person who makes the decision to do thing X is the person that actually configures and installs thing X.
Absolutely. So really, you want some sort of oversight.
Absolutely.
When they make those changes.
And that's what this process does for you.
Okay. And this note here. So we talked about, and you mentioned people that can install software on the machine, but it says users can have local admin rights. They can have that.
They can definitely. You would have to operate off the 2-account concept, where I have a regular account for day-to-day use, and if necessary, I would switch over and log in with a local admin account. But the one thing you have to remember, that is an enemy of change management, because it is very difficult to make sure that the change management processes are followed when your standard users have access to privileged credentials on a workstation. So it is allowed, but it's not recommended because it's very tough to keep up with change management.
All right. And maintaining.
The big thing here is to remember, this is a continuous process. If there's one thing that I want to call out here is to document your process. Nobody likes to create policies, but if you just simply document your configuration management process, you are more likely to follow it than if it's not documented. You'll keep your inventory up to date if you have a documented process, because the change is not complete until the inventory has been updated. The change is not complete until you've updated your baseline configuration. So that is really the biggest thing, and that flows into the system development lifecycle. You plan for your deployment, maintenance, and disposal of your systems, but as you document those processes, it just makes life so much easier.
And this is pretty much a requirement now too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you haven't been doing it, now is the time where you have to do it, because self-attestations are a thing of the past, and the certification is going to check to see, do you have a configuration management process in place? And if you don't, then it's an automatic no.
Awesome. So documentation. All right. And I think that's our last slide. So I see a couple of questions. Is there a CMMC assessment guide similar to the 853 assessment guide or the MEP Cybersecurity Self-Assessment Handbook or 171A?
The jury is still out. There is none of that to date, and we're just all patiently waiting for the day when something like that arrives.
Now, CMMC is kind of like 171, right?
Right.
At least level 3, 1 through 3. There is 171A, correct?
Right, and that's what's been briefed. And listening to some of the CMMC webinars, they've mentioned that the best thing that you can do today is to assess your network based on this special publication, 800-171 Alpha, because it is an assessment guide that's similar to 800-53 Alpha, and it's 110 of the 130 CMMC level 3 controls. And the rest of them, the additional 20, they're fairly easy to understand what the requirement is, but just use use NIST 800-171 Alpha, and that'll get you, 90% of the way.
Awesome. All right, and our next question is, do you have a recommendation for locking down USB ports from external storage devices, but still allowing peripheral like keyboards to work differently?
So that's a great question. So when I was talking about tools that can be used for patch management, vulnerability scanning, things like that, there are many products. Obviously, you have group policy. Group policy will just blanket block everything. But there are categories of tools that can allow you specific access to USB devices or CD drives based on who the user is, or even based on the system that they're accessing it from.
But so for instance, with group policy, it blocks removable media.
Right.
So if you use that, you could still use keyboards and mice and things like that.
Okay, right? I get the question. Absolutely. So when you block removable media devices, it doesn't affect the ability to use keyboards, mice, and things like that. But one note that I want to caution you on is just make sure that when you're buying keyboard and mice that you're getting them from reputable manufacturers, because there is a thing called bad USB. And if you buy keyboards from a manufacturer who has, put malware exploits inside of the keyboards, I know it's a far thing, but just make sure that you're buying your keyboards and mice from reputable vendors, because nothing really checks to make sure that you have a safe keyboard or mouse.
Absolutely. All right. And we have a comment that Alexi's awesome. So
thank you.
All right. Can we offer configuration management templates to begin from?
When you say templates, are we meaning templates in terms of policy, or are we talking baseline templates? What type of template?
Well, the question is templates. So let's start with I like personally configuration management plan.
Right.
Doesn't SANS offer some templates?
SANS has a lot of free templates that are available that basically get you going, whether it's a policy, whether it's a procedural guide. If you search for SANS templates, just make sure you check the right website.
Sure.
But it actually has a lot of templates that I believe are based on the cybersecurity framework, with the templates that they have published.
Yeah, and I think if you go down a little bit, they have an archive where they have some retired stuff.
Absolutely.
That's there.
And it's a lot of good stuff. We reference those from time to time, to get ideas, because we work with clients across various industries. So security is not a one-size-fits-all approach. So sometimes you have to get creative, when you're dealing with policy.
So good.
But I want to answer that from the other side.
Sure.
Just in case you were asking configuration templates regarding baselines, we often recommend a couple of things. The Microsoft Security Compliance Toolkit has some hardened baselines that are available from a group policy standpoint, as well as the Center for Internet Security. They offer hardening guides for the most common operating systems, Microsoft Windows, Windows Server, or Windows 10, also some of the Unix, Linux variants as well. They have hardening guides that can walk you through step by step how to actually configure your systems to be more secure.
And it's, so the vendor offers those. Doesn't NIST have the site?
NIST does have a site. I don't remember exactly what it's called. I believe it's literally called Secure Configuration Baselines.
Something like that. I'm sure if you Google it.
Right. You'll definitely be able to find it. They have information regarding secure baselines available from NIST as well.
And so it used to be that NIST would do their own baseline.
Right.
I think they've pretty much switched to the vendor and CIS
exactly.
at this point. And again, we've brought up CIS a couple of times. Any further information on that?
I will tell you that CIS, there is a lot of free and very good resources available from CIS. Of course, they're going to harvest your email, but that's the cost of doing business in today's time. But you get a lot of free information, but they also have some paid offerings as well. You can actually buy an operating system that's already been hardened from CIS. So if you don't want to worry about doing the work of parsing through a 1,000-page document to secure your operating system, you can actually buy an already hardened version of Windows 2010, for example. But if you don't have the funds for that, potentially the Microsoft Compliance Toolkit may be a very easy way to go. If you're operating in a domain environment, just work with a client yesterday to walk them through the process of actually downloading that tool, making the baseline changes that needed to be made, and then it was imported into Active Directory, and now they're more secure than they were, even 20 minutes before.
Nice. Now, one thing, since I don't see any more questions, is let's talk about Windows 7 and Server 2008.
So Windows 7 and Server 2008, there are two things that I'll say. The first thing I'll say is get off of it if you're still on it. The second thing I will say is some of your business processes may require you to continue to operate on those systems. Microsoft is offering what's called extended security updates, where you can actually pay, and I believe for roughly 3 years from January 14th, 2020, you can actually still get updates on those products. From a CMMC standpoint, if you're still operating those products, what you have to do is you have to manage those separately and isolate them from the rest of your systems to reduce the risk. You don't want your system to be compromised because you have a Windows system a Windows 7 system operating or a Windows Server 2008. And in some cases, there are clients still operating Windows Server 2003. I just recently spoke with somebody who has Windows Server 2003 with Exchange 2003 running in their environment. So I don't know how you isolate that.
Yeah.
Can you isolate that? I don't think you can isolate that one because you're going to need your email. But the first thing, get rid of those. Go ahead. There are free tools that are still available to allow you to upgrade directly to Windows 10. You visit Microsoft, you can find those tools very easily to go from a Windows 7 system to a Windows 10 system. The only thing you have to worry about is if you're going from Windows 7 home, it's not going to take you to Windows 10 Pro. So at least you can get to Windows 10 home and then just pay a small fee to go to the upgrade to the Windows 10 Professional.
And one thing, since we're okay, it comes up a lot, is blacklist and whitelist of software.
So blacklisting and whitelisting, it's not, actually that's in this family. So when you deal with blacklisting and whitelisting, depending on who you are, you may like, blacklisting to say, okay, these particular pieces of software I can't run, versus maybe whitelisting and saying only these applications can run. Depending on which one you do is up to you. But there are tools that are available, whether it's inherent to the Windows operating system, it can be configured to provide you whitelisting or blacklisting. But there are also, I've mentioned that there are, again, those categories of tools that can do patch management and things like that. You can have those tools available and categorically block categories of applications versus having to worry about, a specific application. So it really just depends on how you've configured your infrastructure and what your rules are going to be. But either of the two is acceptable, but you have to do one of them. There is no requirement to not do one. You have to do blacklisting or whitelisting.
Now, say so I did everything you said, and I got my inventory of software together. Can I just say that's my whitelist?
You could say that's your whitelist, but I have to read it exactly, but I believe you have to employ something to actually make it happen for you, but I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, I don't recall that you actually have to employ something to do that. In particular, if you remove admin from users, it has to be installed by the IT guy.
Okay, so I just looked at it. It's a level 4 requirement.
Oh, okay.
Once you get to CMMC level 4, you have to actually employ a whitelisting, technology.
Something like AppLocker or something.
Exactly.
But at level 3?
At level 3, not a 100% requirement. You create your whitelist, as Colin mentioned. This is my authorized software list from an inventory standpoint. And if you're preventing people from installing software, without going through the change management process, which would update your authorized software list, then you would be good there as well.
So if I need to add software, I just go through the change management process?
Absolutely. And that change management process, it doesn't have to be a daunting task. It simply can be somebody submits a ticket. Okay, help desk person or whoever's going to make the decision, we don't have that software currently. You can decide, all right, let's call the players to the table. All right, here's the software that they want to install. They want to install Corel Draw because they want to do some drawings. All right, let's do a little quick research. Does it appear that this software doesn't really introduce risk? That they've done some application hardening, they've done some testing, how many users are going to get it? Those types of things. Document that entire process. Whoever gets to say so, yes, we can do it. Now you procure the software, you install it on the system.
Now you said a ticket to a help desk guy. I have a small business, it's me and 5 other people.
It could be an email to start that process. Okay. Whoever the approver within the organization is and whatever process you have set up. I mentioned help desk, but really it could be, I'm going to email Colin because he within Sarah Brand is going to make the decision what software I get. So, hey, Colin, there's this software that I need to do my job. What do I need to do to get it? Send me information on what the software is. Then Colin, in turn, takes a look at the security just to make sure that we're not introducing some compromised software into our system. Once that decision has been checked, it's been good, Colin now decides, okay, let's go ahead and get the software.
All right, so we got a couple more questions, and I'm going to skip around. I apologize. So this recording should be posted on YouTube in the next couple of weeks. That's what we typically do. I know Sarah Brand has a YouTube channel. And they will probably let you know once that is posted. Is there a published supplier list where one can purchase their IT products? I believe the Defense Information Security Agency, now known as Cybercom, has an approved vendor list. I would go that route to make sure you're not getting anything bad.
Right.
You know, and just from research and going to the vendor's website, another good resource is resellers, something like CDW or any of those would be appropriate, right?
Right. So the unfortunate thing is, from a CMMC contractor standpoint, nothing necessarily governs this. I can reiterate something that I heard Katie Arrington mention on one of the webinars that she was taking part in. She sees a future where software vendors are going to have to be at least CMMC level 1.
Mm-hmm.
So today, that's not something that you have to look at. But long term, that may be something. If you're going to pick any software vendor, they may have to have some level of requirement from the government in order to be used for this type of work.
And any recommendations in regards to implementing corporate or enterprise controlled configuration management workflow software that would help?
Workflow is a tough one, right? So if you're talking workflow, if you have access to Office 365, you can really get a great workflow just by using SharePoint alone.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have the resources to develop that from a SharePoint standpoint for you, you can do something as simple as creating a set of lists that somebody can actually use a form, add a request, and then it can completely be controlled directly through SharePoint. But you could also go as far as to contract with many of the SharePoint developers, and they can create whatever your process is going to be in your own SharePoint tenant for you. But SharePoint provides a great amount of functionality that can definitely improve your workflow. But workflow is always a tough one because oftentimes that's some level of custom application being built, but SharePoint can do it all for you.
And we have a question regarding, and I love this question, is 365 with E3 and its compliance. So this one's a tough one. Microsoft has said that O365 commercial does not support Deforest requirements at this time. In general, for CUI, at this time, GCC or GCC High is the route to go. If you're handling ITAR information, there's been some rule changes that I'm not going to get too far into, but if you're handling ITAR, International Traffic in Arms Regulation information, it's likely it should go into GCC High. Again, there's been some rule changes. I recommend you check out the Department of State on that. But again, per Microsoft, O365 commercial does not support Deforest requirements. All right, we've hit just about our hour. Thank you, Alexi, for being here and providing us this great information. And thanks for everybody that listened in today. If you have questions, please feel free to hit us up at info@sarahbrin.com, and we'll get you a response. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Have a good one.